life of the Community College of Denver. This begins something that we believe will be a tradition at the Community College of Denver, happening whenever a cohort of Community College of Denver faculty retire. Among that cohort of retirees, one person will be selected. There'll be a committee established over time with criteria to represent that class in giving a last lecture. This year I took the presidential prerogative of identifying amongst the few who will be retiring this year a faculty member to represent them in giving the inaugural first lecture, the first of the last lectures. It is a tradition that was created by a faculty member at another university in the United States who happened to have a terminal illness, and his institution decided that they would honor him by creating a final lecture for him. It occurred to me that that was a great idea to inaugurate it at this institution for a faculty member who was perfectly healthy, just happened to be retiring. So that's what we're doing. This is not a requiem. This is not a wake. This is a celebration of the thoughts and ideas of an individual who has spent a life in the academy thinking what academics should think about, and those are the ideas that animate humanity. Well, I'm going to stop there and introduce the person who will in fact introduce our last lecturer today, and that is Stacy Beckman. Stacy Beckman can best be described as an individual a student who has recently won a California and national award for being the individual lawyer who created for the first time in this country a legal precedent that said you cannot handcuff an individual simply because he or she is an undocumented alien. You just simply cannot put handcuffs on them and criminalize that individual. Fast forward, that lawyer, having won that national case and creating a new precedent for men and women who are striving to breathe free, just as our immigrants have in the past, that former CCD student wrote to Stacy Beckman and said, Stacy, wrote and said, Stacy, because of what you have taught me, I was able to, in fact, use those principles of social justice in advancing a case that is unique to me. That's the kind of professor, that's the kind of role model, that's the kind of mentor that Stacy Beckman represents, not just to that successful attorney who graduated a couple of decades ago, almost a couple of decades ago, but to all of us. Could you join me in giving a rousing, warm round of applause to Stacy Beckman?
I'm going to welcome all. Today you witness the Community College of Denver's inaugural last lecture. I thank President Freeman for instituting what is sure to become a fine tradition here at the college. Having been asked to introduce Larry Paolo for his last lecture at the Community College of Denver, the enormity of the task upon me, and through many false starts, I find myself anchored at this beginning point. Quite simply, there is no one like him. I've never met another like Larry. When I recently chastised Professor DiPaolo for his overweening consistency in arranging facts so that he might always see the very best in others, he freely admitted this tendency as a character flaw. Of course, generosity of spirit, self-possessed grace, and consistent graciousness are never flaws. And I found myself on that occasion, as is so often the case when I'm with Larry, examining my own words and conclusions. Larry inspires in us thoughtful self-reflection, and we are better for it. Quixotic and possessed with an intellect of stunning depth and remarkable breadth, Larry describes himself as an 18th century Catholic monarchist. Much out of time with the grinding gizmos wrought by a culture too frequently disenfranchised from its own heartbeat, and perhaps more tragically, its capacity for critical thought. But were it only the case that all monarchs, all authority, all of those in leadership positions possessed Larry's deep understanding of the humanities and the illumination this broad understanding offers. Larry stands unwavering as a man of wit and purse capacity. Over nearly 20 years of friendship, his uncompromising irreverence and liberating insights have delivered me repeatedly from forces base and unjust. He has oft stood alone, courageously demanding that we reject the prescriptive directives that slowly grind creative professionals into automatons. He reminds us that we are human, noteworthy for our notorious brains and our terrific capacity for intellectual transcendence. He begs of us, use your mind, develop your interior life, embrace critical thinking, reject the herd mentality. For 41 years, Professor Paolo has posited our humanity right before us. When systems and processes and jargon and gizmos and nonsense would enslave us, pull us down, or worse, pull us backward. He reminds us that as educators, as scholars, we are obligated to stand in the Sophoclean light so that we might better enable our charges to experience the full measure of their intelligence and their potential. A wise former dean once said to me, "In order to have a college, Stacy, you need but two things. First, and most essential, you must have students. Next, and nearly just as critical, you need teachers. All the rest must remain in service to that essential core, lest our mission become corrupt." It sounds so simple. For 17 years, I've stood by Professor DePaulo's side and watched that very critical central precept, students and teachers, and what goes on in the classroom, be pushed aside further and further into the margins, while the institution of higher education becomes ever more obsessed with serving itself and justifying its own existence, as if it were a thing apart, sharing nothing symbiotic with those it purports to serve. As an unapologetic intellectual, Larry stands at a rakish angle to this dominant trend. Like a true humanist, he insists that we are more than cogs, more than a statistician's fodder or a marketeer's bundle of crunched numbers. He chides us pointedly for our betrayal of the grand tradition of the university. In a recent conversation with him, I speculated that even the most humble library contains more knowledge than the aggregate of every single television program ever aired. In response, I got the characteristic DePaulian sigh with splayed hands to the forehead. And, oh, dear Stacy, so much information, so little knowledge. In a culture that loves to hear itself talk, but often has so very little to say, Professor DePaulo stands as an anomaly, tirelessly, steadily advocating for quiet reflection and the interior life of the mind. I am not sure who the Community College of Denver is without his imprimatur. I am not sure who we will become absent his intellectual gravitas. Larry demands that we recognize that the essence of what goes on in the classroom can never be captured in cold, lifeless reports, no matter how numerous and no matter how often we change the acronym driving them. We seek Larry out for his wisdom, for his knowledge, his well-informed critical analysis, his wit, and his kindness. And Larry reminds us of this, our humanity. I humbly introduce him now, as eager as you are to hear his final lecture at the Community College of Denver.
Thank you for that warm applause. I'll be curious to see if that applause is as warm at the end of my lecture. And I want to thank Stacy for her eloquent and moving tribute. I had to bite my hand to make sure I wasn't crying. If you ever want to bask in brilliance, have a conversation with Professor Beckman. Our college is beset with some serious issues for some time, and I am serenely aware that these issues could judiciously be remedied if people would simply listen to Stacy Beckman's wise counsel. I have some preliminary people to acknowledge before my lecture. I want to first thank all of those who are employed by the college who have organized this event, and if they are here, I would ask them to stand. Francie Ann Hood, Cynthia Phillips, Rhonda Pelican, Petra Rodriguez, Sue Samuelson, Emily Willen, who is ill today, and Kayla Zelig. So I would like to give them a round of applause. I want to also thank my fellow Italian, Chris Accarese, who's filming the event today. And a special note to Aaron Graff. If you look at your programs, this is his photograph. Aaron is very much a part of our college. He's one of my former students and also Professor Beckman's. And when he graduated from CCD in 2007, Aaron was he received our Distinguished Student Award. He is also the author of the last newspaper article on me in this campus, which comes out tomorrow, I believe, in our newspaper, The Star, under the guidance of Professor Christy Struther, if she is here, if she would stand. There she is. I want to thank Professor Chuck Parsons for the splendid interview panels that he created. That sketch of me was drawn by Chuck Parsons when he was sitting in on one of my classes. I also want to thank John Chose, and the graphic design students for carrying out the project. Chuck Parsons is one of the most generous and talented individuals you will ever meet. He's such a splendid colleague. I want to acknowledge the unsung heroes of CCD, our classified staff. They keep faculty sane while we do our best to drive them insane. I want to thank Mary Somerville, the director of the area library, and all the librarians and library staff. Our students are extraordinarily fortunate to have at their disposal a university library. It is rare for a community college to have this luxury. As a member of the area library tri-institutional advisory board for a number of years, I can tell you that Mary has always included us in her plans. So I'd like to have a hand for Mary Somerville, if you could stand. There is another retiree this year I must recognize. I think every faculty member has been the beneficiary of the unfailing kindness and patient instruction of Mr. Jim Bryant. You can stand. His departure will cause great weeping in the land. I have saved comments about Dr. Everett Freeman as a culmination for the reason that were it not for him, this event would simply not be taking place. He is the sole begetter of the last lecture series. I have seen regimes at CCD come and go, and for those of us who have been here a number of years, we must confess that it's been a rather mixed bag. I have gotten to know Dr. Freeman as both a humanist and a scholar, which is not always accompanies his position. What impresses me most about Everett Freeman is his interaction and commitment to our students. He has invited them to his office to chat, to encourage their further educational advancement. He has asked them to sit in his chair. Point blank, he has asked students, and now how long do you think it will be to get your PhD? And again, this is a rare trait because so often in the higher echelons of administration, students are head counts for funding. A number of my students, after chatting with Everett Freeman, have said, he really talks to us like he's a concerned father. And indeed he is. I feel greatly honored to initiate this last lecture series. All my life, I've been a champion of the traditional. And in a stroke of irony, Everett Freeman has talked me into being an innovator at last. It's not going to last. But I am very comfortable that I am saying farewell under the benevolent leadership of Everett Freeman. Now to work. I want to welcome everyone who is here today my friends, my colleagues, my wonderful students, past and present, honored guests. My subject today is the humanities and the interior life of students. Recently, I was listening to Francis Poulenc's opera, Dialogues of the Carmelites, and a specific line caught my attention. All thoughtful people must ask themselves, what is it we serve? Looking back over 41 years of college teaching, I can say with certainty that I do not serve our current educational system intent on dumbing down the entire American population. I do serve, with great pride and loyalty, the grand tradition of liberal arts education as it has rung out over the centuries, going back to the establishment of the great European universities of the 12th century, themselves rooted in the profound legacy of classical antiquity. Here is a continuum of history that we lose at our peril, but which every day fades more faintly into the past. I have been privileged to earn my livelihood by doing what I loved, passing on the great works of the past to students in the present. I have enjoyed the classroom, and I will miss it. Even more, I have treasured my one-on-one mentorship of many of my students and have watched with great pleasure the progress of their lives beyond the classroom. I have been at Community College of Denver so long, over the years, I have taught the children and now the grandchildren of some of my original students. But I have also witnessed the terrible decline of American education, to me, a national tragedy. I have watched the betrayal of our students, our future. It has been difficult to watch. I think it is hard for most people to live in a society in decline while still pretending that it is at the top of its game. We have not reached this current low point overnight. It has been several decades in the making. Though I am speaking of the liberal arts in general, I am focusing on the humanities, in particular, art, literature, and music, all those irrelevant things in today's world. From elementary school through college, public education has marginalized the humanities, thus robbing our students of what was once central to all formal education, the growth and development of their interior lives, by which I mean their intellectual life and their spiritual life, in whatever form that may take. I am speaking in the words of Cardinal Newman as the formation of character. John Henry Cardinal Newman has been a major influence on my pedagogy almost from the start. An old friend of mine from Victorian England, he was the author of one of the most important books on higher education, The Idea of a University, a work quite unknown in modern academe. He was facing in his day what we are facing in ours, the takeover of education by industry. Of course, in his time, industry did not own England as corporate business now owns the United States. In a famous chapter, Newman delineates the difference between liberal knowledge and mechanical training. Mechanical or useful knowledge has no real impact on the intellect. It depends on rules and procedures committed to memory. It exhausts itself on the production of tangible things. It is characterized by the passive mind. Liberal knowledge manifests the active mind. It rises to abstract thinking, Plato's realm of the conceptual, unchecked by tangible ends. I quote, "To have mapped out the universe is the boast, or at least the ambition, of philosophy." Well, here's a bold counter to our current fixation on measurable goals. No teaching to the test for Newman. What is the purpose of higher education, according to Newman? To cultivate the mind and refine the soul. Cultivate, refine, mind, soul. These terms belong to the interior life of students. They refer to the transformative powers from within, rather than the employment of external skills from without. They refer to the acquisition of the liberal arts rather than the execution of useful tasks. They point the way to the infinite instead of terminating in the finite. In short, Newman is completely at odds with the job training mentality of 21st century education. Instead of being acted upon by the world, the passive mind, liberal arts students take a view of the world, the active mind. Newman focuses on the personal rather than the merely expedient. And this personal touch extends from the students to the institutions of learning as well. Note, learning, not training. I quote, "A university is, according to the usual designation, an alma mater, knowing her children one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a treadmill." For the sake of brevity in this lecture, I conflate foundry, mint, and treadmill to one useful word, factory. I wish I could register this mutation of alma mater into grim factory under the heading of progress, but I cannot. Incidentally, for those of you who have allowed your Latin to lapse, alma mater means wise mother. I know that many students, in my experience, I would say most, are eager for knowledge. I see it in their eyes. I hear it in their questions. But I also know that most students come to college woefully unprepared in the basics of reading and writing skills. The two go together. Add a third, thinking skills, and we have a trinity. Sometime in the late 1970s, Gore Vidal, that notorious scourge of America's proud ignorance, made a comment on television that has haunted me ever since. "I have never in my life met a stupid 7-year-old, but I am hard-pressed to find a bright 17-year-old. Now, something must have happened in between, and I suspect it was the public schools." then the clincher. The failure of our public schools on every level is too complete to have been an accident. Several years later, I was able to discuss this statement personally with Vidal. Wistfully, he shook his head. Having financed the campaigns of our nation's office holders, corporate business now owns the United States. The last thing our corporate masters want is an educated populace. What they want is a nation of impressionable consumers. The job of the public schools is to enforce conformity. Yet, conformity is not at the core of the grand tradition of higher learning. That honored place belongs to independent thinking. Without it, the quest for knowledge could not occur. My old friend from the 17th century, Descartes, was convinced that skeptical curiosity is an innate human trait. We see it manifested in children when they first ask that most primal of questions, why, which is born of natural skepticism. There is no shutting them up. I like to think that we have all traveled that path. Not all of us nourish that skepticism, however, and not all of us want it. It is much easier to be told what to do and what to think. For some of us, that innate skepticism drives us to years of study, formal or otherwise. It is amazing how many of our ancestors were autodidacts. Indeed, the whole point of formal education for teachers is to help put their students on the path of their own intellectual journey. The reward for seeking the life of the mind is independent thinking. For this reason, we must distinguish between education to lead out and training to hammer in. We must distinguish between knowledge, the active energy of the mind, and information, something that sits inert on a computer screen. Information can lead to knowledge, but it does not become knowledge until, I again echo Cardinal Newman, an active mind invests it with an idea. The best catalyst for an independent mind is reading, that lost art. The fervent reading of great books helps us to sharpen our own minds off the geniuses of historic significance. Reading then becomes a privileged dialogue, and we have a whole Himalayan mountain range of extraordinary books to explore. All we can do in our limited time is to chip away at it. This is why we must not waste any time on pop culture drivel. One of the best kept secrets in the shopping mall of American amnesia is that world culture belongs to us all. There is a foul rumor afloat that the great books serve to keep a power elite in place and the populace down. This is untrue. After decades of reading the great writers of the world, I have discovered that their writings are forever questioning the governing structures and the societal conventions of their own time and place. From Confucius in ancient China to Carlos Fuentes in modern Mexico, we are able to cross continents and centuries. We read them because they are beacons of liberty. They remind us that we are not simply cogs in a wheel. Because of the challenging nature of their content, they remind us that we are thinking beings. They remind us of our own natural skepticism. I know of no major thinker who can be categorized as a team player. There's much emphasis these days on team player, and I always foam at the mouth. Socrates was not a team player, nor was he thanked for his fierce independence. Plato was not a team player by the very fact that he recorded his great mentor's legacy of constant questioning, thus hurtling the Socratic method down the millennia. Dante was not a team player and was exiled from his native city for the rest of his life as proof of it. Voltaire was not a team player, as shown by his lifelong crusade to overthrow both state and church, a rather ambitious task, thus paving the way for the French Revolution and the modern world, for better or for worse, that emerged from it. The deeply spiritual Tolstoy was not a team player and was rewarded by being excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church. I could add many more notable writers to this gorgeous mix, but I am studious of time. Though the thinkers I have named were not team players, they were not psychopaths either. They left behind, in the legacy of their work, a moral or ethical vision that propels their readers to a deeper and higher perception of what it means to be civilized. According to George Steiner, that most profound of literary critics, they help us to create in our minds a mosaic of the indispensable touchstones of wisdom. And when we must face, as we all do, the vicissitudes of life, they help us to find our way home in the dark of the night. Ralph Waldo Emerson, that most reverberant of American thinkers, the author of Self-Reliance, was not a team player, voiced an astonishing epiphany. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. The greatest allies to the interior life of students are silence and solitude. It is imperative that within the framework of our overly busy days, we ruthlessly carve out time to withdraw far from the madding crowd. This is something that the reclusive Emily Dickinson knew firsthand. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. I have been much concerned about the upbringing of our children of late. They seem to lead lives on a choke chain. They have to be at school. They have to be at football practice. They have to be at dance class. They have to be at a scout meeting. Their parents seem frantic to fill their lives with perpetual group activities so that they are never alone. And yet, they must be alone sometime in order to discover who they are or who they are becoming and what they think a way from the pressure of their friends. In short, they are not allowed to develop their interior lives so that by the time they reach college, they have been conditioned to be totally dependent on their electronic devices and worse, social media. How many of our students on entering college are even capable of independent thought? No amount of electronic devices or computerized programs can replace the one-on-one personal mentorship of teacher and student. I think it morally reprehensible for educators to encourage in students a passive dependency on mechanized devices. We as educators should be their guides, not their accomplices. This is why I so hate the digital dictatorship, especially that purveyor of mechanistic dependency called desire to learn. I'm getting out just in time. I'm told that everybody must now be shackled to it starting in the fall. And I don't know why we have to, but I take that up right now. The rationale of the digital dictatorship is that it will help the students to take more control of their own education. This is nothing but system sophistry. If we were truly intent on empowering our students, we would be providing them with a first-class liberal arts college education instead of a low-grade, watered-down, extended high school program. There is a difference between higher education and lower education. I am cursed by memory. I can remember when CCD was very much a college. Yet it seems with each passing year, we march relentlessly toward lower ed. As an alternative, I suggest we put as much distance as we possibly can between ourselves and those miserable public high schools. Let us offer our students an intellectual feast to the study of the humanities so that for many of them, for the first time, or at last, they will be able to develop an interior life through independent thinking. The humanities will open doors for our students they never dreamed of. One of the great pleasures of teaching at an urban college is the mixture of cultures and ages. My special vocation in teaching has centered on adult evening students. And I know from experience, our evening students do not want to be dumbed down. But here is an anecdote about one of my younger students. Several years ago, I taught an uncharacteristic class at CD. It was an afternoon class full of newly minted high school graduates from white suburbia. That had never happened before or since. One day, I showed a video of Jessie Norman, one of the great voices of our time, a majestic lady who grew up in the segregated South before and during the Civil Rights Movement. She was singing a song by Gustav Mahler, Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen, which in essence means, I have withdrawn from the world. It is a poem by Frederick Rupert about the interior life. When the performance had ended, I asked for comments or questions, One of my students, a nice lad, but by no means a scholar, he was just coasting by, raised his hand. With simple candor, he said, "Well, she's the wrong size, she's the wrong color, and she's singing the wrong kind of music. But she's absolutely beautiful." That, for me, was a golden, a memorable moment. He had shown the almost unfathomable ability to get beyond his own cultural conditioning, his own ingrained prejudices, his own age group. The power of art had allowed him to move beyond himself, and he had been open to the power of art. It didn't stop there. A weekend had intervened between then and my next class. He came to my office before the next class and said, "Look what I bought." He showed me a compact disc of Jesse Norman singing Richard Strauss's Four Last Songs. I asked, "Why this recording?" He said, "Because I like this photograph more than the other covers." Which for a neophyte is as good a reason as any. "What do you think of the music?" "I love it," he said, "especially the third song. I can't pronounce it, but her voice goes up and up and up like an eagle in the sky. And look here," he showed me the album booklet. "She sings in German, but there's an English translation, so I can understand everything she sings. I played it for my friends, and they hate it. But I say, it's your loss." All we need to do as educators is open the door. We never know who will accept the invitation. Our journey is almost over. Last semester, President Freeman paid an impromptu visit to my Humanities 122 class. As chance, or the Holy Ghost would have it, we were discussing the first part of the Divine Comedy by Dante, the Inferno, hell. The Divine Comedy, one of the most influential books in the history of the world, is a work about the interior life. As we study Dante's reactions to the souls he meets along the way, we examine our own interior life off the genius of Dante. It is a work about choices we make and the consequences thereof. In the Inferno, the souls of the damned have one thing in common. They have all deliberately chosen to set aside the good of intellect. Though rooted in medieval Catholicism, Dante's great masterpiece, like all great books, is universal in substance. The next day, Dr. Freeman sent me a gracious email. I quote in part, "Every participant was leaning forward, always a true and sure sign of engagement and learning." Thoughtfully, he had sent copies to our provost, my dean, and my chair. They in turn sent me kind encomiums. I responded, thanking them all for their generosity of spirit. What I did not say to them, I tell you now. I was simply doing what educators have been doing for centuries in a direct and uncomplicated way. I did not feel compelled to employ any innovative strategies. I had not come to class equipped with a whole battery of group activities to amuse bored children. I was not hammering surface information into my students' heads so that I could later test them on it and measure how much of it they had retained before they disposed of it for the rest of their lives. Above all, there was not a trace of computerized intrusion to stand between ourselves and Dante. We were a community of scholars gathered together in a classroom, which I take to be a sacramental place, each of us in our own deeply personal way, partaking in the communion of knowledge. Thank you. I think now I'm to entertain questions and wear the crown of martyrdom with some panache.
May I take the prerogative of asking the first question?
Yes.
A number of times in your lecture, I noticed that you referred to Voltaire and to others as your friends.
Yes.
Say something about that.
Long record. You know, I started teaching shortly after Aristotle retired. So I got around over the centuries. And it's been a great pleasure to converse with them. I'm basically a reader. And so they do take up residence in my mind. Reading to me is a conversation. I do view them as my friends, and I always go back to them for wells of wisdom. I think that's what readers do. I can always tell a reader from a non-reader. Readers always have this wonderful sense of references across time and place. They often reference other books. Non-readers usually are locked in their own little pop culture moment, and there's no real perspective there.
Questions?
What is the first book that you plan to read after your retirement?
Well, a number. My big project for retirement is to brush up on my own Latin and read the entire work of Thomas Aquinas in Latin. When I was growing up in parochial school, taking Latin, I was very irritated because we had to read these great classics in Latin. And I thought, why? There are these wonderful translations. I'd never realized that one of the retrograde pleasures of old age would be to read these great writers in Latin. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
But there are so many books I haven't gotten around to. And so many of the 18th century books. Simply because in my reading thus far, I've always asked, are they going to have a particular significance to the classes I teach? Now I can read books that I have set aside, some of the really obscure older books, for my own great pleasure, such as Tobias Smollett's Roderick Random. I've read at it, it's wonderfully, wittily funny, but now I can read it without guilt.
You referenced Gustav Mahler.
Yes,
You have referenced pop culture.
yes,
Gustav Mahler was deeply inspired, affected, and referenced the folk art of what's called folk art of his day. Would that be considered the pop culture
No.
of the time? Would you like to
there's substance to folk culture. And often, one of the ways we can define pop culture as vapid entertainment marketed. And so pop culture preys upon even classical music. How many commercials for automobiles have played Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries? But we are living in a time that pop culture has become absolute dominant. And I think one of the things we must do is to tell the difference between genuine art in terms of folk culture. Think of the various fairy tales or the folk tales that have come down to us, and then when we're recorded by the Brothers Grimm. You see, there's something very deep there that we must not lose. It comes from an oral tradition. So, pop culture is, shall I put it into one reference? Miley Cyrus. I know there's much talk about twerking. But I mean, there's only so far you can go with that. Okay. Anyone next?
I'm going to be starting high school next year. What books would you recommend?
What books? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I'm going to be starting high school next year. What books do you recommend I start reading?
Well, that depends in many ways on your tastes and what you're interested in. But I can tell you, if you're starting high school, you better fortify yourself with classics, because you're not going to get them there. What pops into my mind right now is a very famous masterpiece of American literature that I don't think is recognized as such. And it comes from the 19th century. But it talks much about family bonding. It talks much about facing adversity. It comes out of a wartime situation. And it challenges us in a range of thought. What I'm thinking of right now, and perhaps you've already read it, is Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. It's absolutely superb. And then balance that with Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Pirates are always good for youth. Anything else? Cody Green.
Professor, we've spoken before about the role of an educator as essentially the role of a curator, basically exposing students to these great classics.
Yes.
Do you think teachers should and educators should embrace this, or do you think that they should try to bring something new to it, or do you think they should? I mean, I guess you could bring something new to something just by bringing it about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know your premise. What about, what did you say?
As a curator, the role of an educator as a curator,
Yeah.
exposing students to works from the past.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Yes. If we don't know the past, we have no perspective whatsoever. And this is a great concern of mine. More and more, we lose the past. And in fact, I'm hesitating here. Many of my colleagues are superb readers and some aren't. And I think it's a matter of logic. You cannot pass on to your students that which you yourself do not know. And there is a tendency in the 20th century, starting late in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, that the past just doesn't matter. That great books or art or music of the past is not something living and breathing today, but something that it's information that belongs to the past. And you just study it, memorize it, and that's that. But they must inhabit your mind. There's a continuity in history. It's something I learned in teaching from my own mentors. And I had a wonderful experience in my undergraduate years to have 4 major mentors. They were quite distinct in their own ways. But what they did was pass on that legacy of the past to their students in the present. And I think that is so necessary. Not to forget about the past, and not to become so enamored of this other word that makes me grind my teeth, innovation, which usually is just a meaningless term. But what about the past? Let me give you one example, if I may, from my great mentor, Professor Evans, my mentor in Shakespeare studies. He passed on to us a legacy that he received from his mentor. And he said, for the rest of your life, read 1 Shakespeare play a month. In 3 years and 1 month, you will have covered the 37 canonical plays by Shakespeare. Then there are plays that are disputed, and of course there are Shakespeare sonnets, and also the narrative poems. He said, don't forget about those. But for the rest of your life, keep repeating, read the Shakespeare plays, because when you are in the presence of Shakespeare, you are in the presence of genius. And we need that to repel the poisons that come at us day by day. And I've taken him at his word. Every month I read a play. And in fact, it's coming up in your class. My favorite Shakespeare play, As You Like It. Incidentally, it stars one of Shakespeare's greatest heroines, the witty and brilliant Rosalind. And now every time I read it, I think of Professor Beckman. Okay, who's next?
Hi Larry, I just want to say congratulations on a well-deserved retirement. And my question for you is, you have described yourself as a refugee of the 18th century.
Yes.
Which is the Enlightenment. And I truly believe that you are contemporary Samuel Johnson.
Oh, he was an old friend of mine.
Why that particular century?
Simply because it was the age of reason. We haven't seen the age of reason since the age of reason. And I'm so tired of what has come after. In fact, what was your question, Troy? What book I'm going to read? The first thing I'm going to do when I retire is going to seek out a time machine and get a one-way ticket back to the 18th century. David Long, by the way, how many years ago was that? He is one of my students and has taught here a number of years as an adjunct instructor. Students, I send my bright students to him, and they, of course, they see again the continuance of the tradition of learning. David Long has never dumbed it down. There have been certain student complaints, but I don't know why we should pander to the marginal students. I mean, this is a college, not daycare. We deprive the good students of instructors like David Long if we let them go. That's an injustice to the college level students. And incidentally, I got your card before my lecture. Thank you. Next. I see some hands.
I find myself constantly at different dichotomies with justice. Who would be a good mentor to help me through these struggles?
Well, it's always going to be a struggle. because we go back to ancient Greece, and one of the most famous folk statements that has come down to us is one man's justice is another man's injustice. But the Greeks, who invented and took pride in inventing trial by jury, they thought that was better than the blood feud. The United States hasn't figured that out yet. I would start by reading, it's the only trilogy of Greek dramas, complete trilogy of Greek dramas that has come down to us. It's the Oresteia of Aeschylus. And there will be a start for the meditation on not only justice, but all the problems and all the subtleties, all the contradictions, all the benefits that go with it. The great minds, they never simplify. They always, particularly the Greeks, something simple becomes complex for them. The reason why they thought the blood feud was barbaric was because it had to do with the letting of blood. So in the blood feud, you also get this from the Old Testament tradition, an eye for an eye, that if you kill my father, I'll have to kill your father, you in the meantime. So they didn't think that that was a good idea at all. So they needed a kind of refinement to that. And so they initiated that idea of trial by jury. But it's interesting that the Greeks had to somehow sanctify that idea by going back to their past, those ancient myths of the oral tradition. So it's always complex. The Greeks thought the most important invention of the human mind was the concept of justice. And you're going into a very practical field with all the rampant crime in the world, precisely because people aren't reading the classics. If more people read, these things would be eliminated.
I might also suggest Plato's Republic for the...
I can't hear.
Plato's Republic for the up-and-coming criminal justice student.
Oh, Plato, I was reminded by Professor Beckman. Why don't you stand up and
Well,
tell
no,
it?
did they tell him?
She's being my prompter. Plato's Republic, of course, it's one of the principal books in the history of the world. So that has also been suggested. Have you taken any paralegal courses?
I haven't yet.
Do I have a teacher for you? Get into Professor Beckman's class, particularly on constitutional law, which, by the way, should be a general course for all students, not confined to paralegal students.
We have time for one final question.
But I was just getting started.
Good afternoon. As a freshman composition instructor, I also often lament on the low skills in thinking. They're coming out of high school being taught
Yes.
what to think, not how to think.
Yes.
So could you give us some of your advice on how to teach them how to think?
Overthrow the corporate dictatorship. They hold us captive by producing junk that nobody needs. Say no to them. You're not going to believe this, but in the privacy of my office one night, after my evening class and my students in conference had left, I invoked the great God, Google. I typed in Colorado Commission of Higher Education. And lo, a wonder came to light. In reading the profiles of the commissioners, I discovered that all of them were connected with business and finance. not one of them was a full-time college professor of the liberal arts. Here is an absurdity. A commission on higher education, with higher education left completely out of the picture. And we are under the sway of this entity. Maybe they're just front people for something even more sinister. I am reluctant to look into my crystal ball, but I do think that the work of the 21st century will be to create two social classes: a ruling class of technocrats and a vast underclass to serve them. And now I realize that our task, not only here at CCD, but I think this is for all state schools now, that our task is not to educate, but to train the underclass to serve them. And I would urge us not to let that happen. The problem with writing skills is all to reading. If your students are reading with care and attention, the great books, not in a hot drill, then I think they're going to learn how to write by inhabiting the page. But that's not an overnight task, and we cannot teach students to write merely by formula. There has to be something to back it up. I don't think I've given you any comfort.
There's one final question.
Mr. DiPaolo, as a current student of yours, and I see many others around me here, I cannot help but realize that I feel akin to the acquaintances of Socrates in the end of the trial and death of Socrates, when they are weeping because they realize how much of a loss Socrates will be to the community. So what are we to do without you?
You will have to soldier on. But have I not in your classes given you a reading list? The reading list, I never plan these reading lists, but in every class, in the context of our discussions, I say, put that on your reading list. They're always the great books, the major thinkers. And it's a reading list for life. So when you read them, think of me, as I am in my 18th century monastery of my mind, reading great books. I'm going to miss students such as yourself, and I see so many faces of my students, both present and past. But for all things there is a season. I would continue to teach, but I will not bend the knee to all this digital stuff. It's just intolerable for me. So.
That's just been special.
Well, President Freeman and all of us at in the community of the Community College of Denver would like to present to Larry yet another award from the college.
I have a wall full of them, but I'm taking them back to the 18th century with me.
This is just a show of our appreciation and great respect and love for you.
I'm always happy to get an award from Rosalind from Azure Light. Thank you.
And one final thing, on behalf of the CCD Foundation, and many of you have contributed to the foundation. We hope you continue to contribute to the foundation. We would like to provide you a small purse in recognition and gratitude for your final lecture. This has been special, has it not?
Those time machines are expensive. This is the price of the ticket.
Will you be around just for a couple more minutes in
Yes.
case people want to come up? If you want to come up, feel free to. One more round of applause for our